Uh, Thank you for that. I just want to note for our audience, consistent theme of our discussion of democracy has been bipartisanship, that these are issues that Republicans and Democrats share a common perspective. Here's Chris Krebs, who worked for President Trump, lauding the work done by successors in a Democratic administration. Michael McFaul, I want to ask you about the issue that Chris raised. You could argue the most immediate, visceral threat to democracy is 100,000 Russian troops along the Ukraine border who appear to be preparing for a possible invasion of Ukraine. You know Vladimir Putin as well as any former ambassador. You've watched him close up. You've been tongue lashed by him. Let me ask you what judgment you'd make about what he's going to do. Is he bluffing? Is he going to go over that line? Is there a way to finesse his demand for some sort of guarantees for Russia's security without doing something that we'll regret for decades?
I don't know, David, and nobody else knows. That's the first thing I want to say. I do know Putin pretty well. I first met him in 1991, so we go way back. And I dealt with him in the government. I've written about him. And the other thing I know is that Vladimir Putin likes ambiguity. He likes uncertainty. He's very comfortable in this moment right now. Whereas Americans were not very comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. That was a very stark lesson I learned working in the government. I was in the government for 5 years with Obama, President Obama's administration. You know, we're kind of engineers, David. You know, if there's a problem out there in the world, we want to fix it and we want to get in there with gusto and find a solution. Vladimir Putin's very comfortable with ambiguity about sovereignty, about wins. And very vividly, I remember, you know, right before I left in 2014 from Moscow, actually the day that Putin invaded Ukraine was the day I ended my tenure as ambassador. And in the run up to that, to remind your listeners and viewers, you know, we were in a contest over whether Mr. Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, would sign up with the European Economic Union, Eurasian Economic Union that Putin was pushing versus the European Union. And in that initial battle, the Russians won. They gave him more money. And I saw a very senior Russian government official around that time. And he said, Mike, here's your problem, you Americans. He was speaking about the West. He said, number one, we care more about Ukraine than you do. And number two, you guys have short time, attention spans. So, you know, we'll be here forever. You'll forget about us and time will move on. And I think about that quote because here we are now. We're not talking about Aphasia. We're not talking about South Ossetia. We're not talking about Crimea. All those are parts that we don't talk about. We're talking about the new invasion, the new guarantees we have to make to Putin. And already because of that, I would say that's a major victory for Vladimir Putin. That he's pocketed those victories. That's part of the past. And nobody's talking about those interventions and those violations of sovereignty before. And number two, he likes the fact that he so far he's given nothing. He's indicated no concessions. And we're now talking about concessions, right? So just, I think from his point of view and the proposals that are now going to be talked about even today and tomorrow, that's already a second victory. The third victory we have to avoid is things that we will live to regret, as you just said. And I actually feel pretty good about where President Biden is so far. I thought the meeting he had, it's always good to meet with leaders, even adversaries. I firmly agree with that. But it was also important the messaging that he said otherwise. We actually don't know what they really said in that meeting. Let's be clear about that. I wrote many of those readouts when I worked for President Obama, and they're not exactly every word was exactly what happened in the meetings. We left some things out from time to time. You wouldn't be surprised. So, and the Russian readout, by the way, was quite different than the American readout. But the main message that President Biden delivered was there will be real consequences of military intervention. And I think that was the appropriate thing to do then. The devil will be now in the details if there will be continued negotiations. And to oversimplify, Vladimir Putin wants a Yalta 2.0. He wants to sit with Biden. He actually doesn't want the Brits there anymore, but he wants to sit down with Biden and carve out a sphere of influence, a new sphere of influence for Russia, and agree to the rules of the road for European security. That would be a horrendous mistake to agree to that, both in substance and form. In form, we should want a Helsinki 2.0, which is that, yeah, let's talk about European security. I think that's appropriate. And there's been a lot of erosions of those institutions over the last several years and decades. And some of that was on our side. I want to be clear. The INF treaty recently, the Trump administration walked away from. That was, in my view, a mistake. And that we don't have that in place is not good. The CFE treaty is more or less moribund. So I think a big conversation about new European security issues and maybe even some new norms, and probably treaties are too hard in America anymore, but a big conversation. But it's got to be with Ukrainians in the room, not the Ukrainians be the subject of those negotiations. And that I'm not sure Vladimir Putin will agree to.